number, going to the door, glanced at by the SS man, whichever functionary it was, a number corresponding to that person's number. One way, life, the other way to the death. Now, to the gas. Right? And everyone, the people in the room, there was a young man who was just recently there in camp. Everybody knew you remember that he was going to live. Strong, young still. And an old man, 60. Right? Everybody knew he was going to die. And when the results came back, the old man was to live and the young man was to die. And nobody knew why, but everybody knew why. The SS man just had a moment of inattention. Maybe doesn't speculate that he argued with his wife that morning. Had he not left his breakfast? Was he thinking of something? And he put one card the wrong way. And then because of that, he put the next card the wrong way, but then he corrected himself, and the numbers went on. But it wasn't worthwhile to go back and change the numbers. The young man was going to die anyway. That was the purpose of the camp. It didn't matter to him whether it happened today or tomorrow. Who dies for a yes or a no. And you need to hear that story as you read that line. Who fights for a crust of bread. After the war, there was in Canada a program in which someone could take someone from Europe, have them live in the household, learn English, help around the household, and then after 6 months or so go and join the larger society. That happened in my family with a young woman by the name of Elspeth, Elizabeth from Poland. And when I was a kid, she told me that she remembered in Germany, Berlin, people fighting in the streets for a piece of rotten potato to try to stay alive. Who fights for a crust? Is that a human? Consider whether this is a woman without hair in her name. The glory of a woman is her hair. Part of Solomon's wisdom, as traditionally said. With no more strength to remember. Primo Levi remarks, you'll have written in the book, that if there is one image for the show, it would be of a person standing there, abject, head bowed, with no idea at all in their minds. Just utterly evacuated of the power of thought. With no more strength to remember, eyes empty and laugh cold as a frog in winter. And then the great line, consider, this has been. Levi didn't know at the point that he wrote this, though he knew by the point of his death, of what seemingly gets to be called Holocaust revisionism. But he did know that the Germans intended to erase all record of what had gone on in camp. And the expectation on the part of the Germans that if any word did leak out, the world wouldn't believe it. Because this just couldn't be proved, done that. And Levi's simple start words, consider, meditate, meditate, this has been. It is unescapable. What Primo Levi laments, among the things he laments about Auschwitz, in relation to us humans, it's entered the world of fact. It can never not have been. We have to deal with its meaning. We must. There's no human power, says he at the beginning of the second book of Truth, that can erase it. It's an inexhaustible fountain of evil, and it continues and circulates amongst us as hatred among the survivors. Primo Levi did not want to hate. But what does one do? I was lecturing on Primo Levi once, and a woman, a mature woman in her 50s, came up to me at lunchtime and said, Professor Williams, could I ask you a question? Where do I put my hatred? Where do I put my anger? She said, I'm a psychiatrist. I know every route possible. But she said, those who did this to my parents, and they both died in camp, They're not asking forgiveness. They are not saying they were wrong. Now she said, if they were to say, I'm sorry, even, I wish I hadn't done it. I know what to do with my anger. But you tell me, what do I do with my anger? Where do I put it? It circulates amongst us yet as anger, suspicion. An older man sitting in on the class of Prima Levi here came up to me afterwards, probably late 50s, 60, and he said to me, Mr. Williams, why don't the Jews trust us Christians speaking themselves? I said, let's talk a little history. You know, but it survives that way. How do you recognize the Shoah and its reflex in us? Do you see? How do we see its traces in our social distances and joinings? Well, I command these words to the moral authority of the one who has suffered. There's a man who has written a book called Vessels of Evil, comparing African-American slavery and the Shoah. Lawrence Mordecai Thomas. He is, as a matter of fact, both African-American and Jew. And he insists that we give what he calls moral deference to the one who suffers. We listen to their account. We don't say, oh, you shouldn't be feeling that way. Well, it's really not the way you think it is. We who haven't suffered. Do you follow what I mean? We listen first to the account and give moral deference to the account of those who have suffered. Engrave them on your hearts when you're in your house, when you walk on your way, when you go to bed, when you rise. Repeat them to your children. Or may your house crumble. And now you see, que la malatia vi impedisca. May sickness, malady impede you. But at the root of that, does anybody do Latin? Is the Latin word pes, or Italian piede. And has anyone been to a Holocaust museum? Remember all those shoes? Death begins with the shoes, death begins with the feet. And now you understand the strength of that line. If you do not tell these things, may malady strike your feet. Because someday it may be you. Not to listen, not to question, not to speak. And may your children turn their faces from you. Another challenge to communication is what Levi came to called willed ignorance. Right? Take a look at the poem On Trial. It's not that people didn't know simply. It's that they willed not to know, not to ask questions, right? For fear of taking on knowledge, and with knowledge, moral responsibility. Right? So, this On Trial, there was a company called the Zinc Company, and this is of the Zinc Company. The trial is in Nuremberg. What do you know about Nuremberg? Anything? Yeah.
Well, it was the place of the 1935 Nuremberg law that started the racial campaign, and then later in 1946 is where the former allies had the trial against the Nazis.
Bravo! Both of those need to be on your minds as you hear this poem. The Nuremberg rallies, the laws, and then after the war. Another thing you need to, well, let's leave it to you. My name? Alex Zink. Where were you born? Oh, Nuremberg, that ancient, illustrious city. Rightly famous, honest judge. Because first, because certain laws were passed there that have no interest here. Second, for a debatable trial. You know, you can say one thing about the trial, you can say another. They were simply put up show pieces looking for a, you know, they didn't really do justice anyway. They were just what the Allies wanted to find a scapegoat. Second, for a debatable trial. Third, because the best toys in the whole world are produced there. You see this men's scale of values. Right? There were certain laws, we won't talk about those now. There was a trial, well, you can say one thing or another, but oh, we make good toys. Tell me how you live, and don't lie. It would be useless here. Oh, I was hard-working, Your Honor. Stone on top of stone, Deutschmark after Deutschmark. I founded a model industry. The best buckram, the finest felt were made by the Zinc Company. I was a humane and diligent boss, honest prices, generous salaries, never complained from my customers, and above all, as I was telling you, the best felt produced in Europe. Did you use good wool? Oh, extraordinary wool, Your Honor. Loose or in braids, wool of which I had the monopoly. Black wool and chestnut, tawny and blonde, and more often gray or white. From what flocks? I don't know. Didn't interest me. I paid for it in cash. Tell me, have your dreams been tranquil? Well, usually yes, Judge. Though sometimes in my dreams I've heard grieving ghosts groan. Weaver, step down. You see the point? The Zinc Company bought up the hair which was shaven from the people at Auschwitz. At a bargain, they had the monopoly on it and made the best felt in Europe. From what flocks did that wool come? Oh, I don't know. Didn't interest me. Paid for it in cash. Right? That's willed ignorance. He could have known, but best not ask questions. Though the description of the braids, do you follow? And that willed ignorance has gone on and on and on. Right? People not wanting to know. And then, if they hear something of the story, listening only to the time where they can insert their own stories. Take a look at the piece called Cloister. This is from a book of Primo Levi's that characteristically is thought not to be about the show. In fact, it is one of the most profound meditations on communication and communication about the show among them that exist, but one needs to be tuned to it. There is a rigger, sort of civil engineer, but not educated, learned his trade. And he is speaking in this book, his name is Fausone. He is speaking in this book with a lady character. One of the questions is, how can a college-educated, university-educated person, liberally trained as well as in his chemistry, which Primo Levi loved, can they communicate with someone who is untrained? You know about the suspicion of the trades of high intellectuals. Right? Can they communicate with one another? Do they understand? Can a man communicate with a woman? Really? Can a Jew communicate with a Gentile? Can a Jew communicate with an Arab with a Jew? Really, can they communicate? Do you follow my meaning? Is it possible? And so here's Fausone. And this chapter begins, well, it's unbelievable. That's it. You come to find out that Primo Levi has just told him the story, which is the Canto of Ulysses. You can infer. You've read it by now in this book, profound as it is. I hope I have a moment or two. I can understand how you wanted to write about it. Yes, I know something myself. My father told me. He was in Germany too, well, in a different situation. In any case, I'll tell you this, I've never taken on any jobs in Germany. It's a place I've never liked. And I can get along in lots of languages, even with a smattering of Arabic and Japanese, but I don't know a word of German. One of these days, I'll tell you about my father, the story of how he was a prisoner of war. But it's not like yours, it's more something to laugh at. And I've never been in prison either, because nowadays, to end up in jail, you really have to do something big. All the same, can you believe it? I had a job once that for me was worse than prison. And if I ever did really have to go to jail, I don't think I'd last 2 days. I'd bash my head against the walls, or else I'd die of heart failure, like nightingales and swallows when you try to keep them in the cage. And don't get the idea this happened to me in some far-off country. No, it was a stone's throw from home, a place where on a clear day, if there's a wind, you can see Superga and the Mole Antoniana, which was formerly a synagogue. But around these parts, you don't get clean air all that. Now, they called me. You see what's happened? Primo Levi has just told him of Auschwitz and the story of the conduct of Ulysses. And he responds with what I call premature understanding. First of all, well, it's unbelievable. That's the problem, isn't it? Some people don't believe it. It's so far outside. Right? And then I can understand how you read it. People rush in and say, oh, I understand. You lost your child? Oh, I understand. I had an aunt who lost her child. Right? Someone died. Oh, I understand how you feel. Do you follow what I mean? When they don't at all. And they haven't experienced it. It's what I call premature understanding. An attempt to, and then, along with it, and then, you know, I can understand. I know something like this too. My father told me stories. Of course, he was in Germany. Of course, it wasn't like you, but he was in Germany. And you know, I'm so good. I haven't learned a word of German as a result, but you know, I don't like Germans. And so you've got to like me because I don't like Germans, you see. And I share that with you. I'm morally virtuous because I don't like Germans. I don't take any jobs in Germany either, even though I know a lot of languages. And by the way, I don't think I'd live 2 days if I were... Yes, this is no offense. Levi lived through nearly a year of Auschwitz. What's he saying to Levi? That I love freedom more than you do? You know, I'd go and bash my head against it. You know, I just died, kind of like a swallow, a nightingale in a cage. Do you follow the offensiveness of that? And then he listens, and here's the point of Levi. He listens to Primo Levi's story only far enough that he can begin to tell a story of his own. How well do we really listen to one another? Do you follow? Their minds not really tracking on Levi's story, only waiting until the point when he would say, you know, that reminds me, and then taking over the story. The challenges to communication are enormous. I do want to spend a moment, and it will only be a moment, on a couple more points. The Contra of Ulysses. It's one of the most difficult in the work, but it is that chapter, and there is no representation of it on the sheets. That chapter is one of the most complex in his work. Levi is testing you, really. How well you understood to this point. Because, for example, in the narration he will say, Lignutani from Rome goes by. Never. That's all he says. What do you know about Lignutani from that? He's going to be in the gas soon. You know that. Death begins with a shoot. You understand. There's Frankel the spy. Who's that? Quiet. He does evil for good's sake. Frankel is a Jewish. He's agreed to spy for the Germans. Better be quiet. Levi makes moral distinctions, even amongst the prisoners. They are all victims, but they are not all moral equivalent of one another. He doesn't attempt to take the category of victimhood and make it a blanket which covers human difference, human reality. It's a matter, a long, complex matter. At the end, he's going with someone who is drawn out of a hole. That's what Pausanias is talking about. And Levi he wants to learn some Italian to Jean Piccolo. And Levi tries to do it out of Primo Levi. Ironic that an Italian Jew should understand his Italianness through that book which they were asked to read and asked to read in schools, the great Christian poem of the High Middle Ages, in which Judas, who is a homonym for Jew, is shown in the mouth of the devil at the bottom of hell. In any case, the language is glorious. And Levi tries to teach. There comes at that point, says Levi, who never tries the big explanations, an understanding which came to me, perhaps the reason for our being here today. And what it is, I'll simply give it to you. I'd love to work it out with you on the words. Perhaps you can do it in sections, perhaps you can do it yourselves. Is that in the story of Ulysses, Ulysses comes to a shore and a whirlwind comes from that shore, the new land, and whirls the boat about 3 times the Trinitarian number until the poop goes, the prow goes down and the poop goes up and the waters closed over them as pleased another. That's the Christian God sending Ulysses, who's trying to achieve human perfection and satisfaction in his own terms, to hell, to death, because he's not come the Jesus way. Because he is the other. And Primo Levi thinks that the reason the Germans did what they did is that they're destroying the Jews because they are the other, that they've snapped themselves into the position of a god who would destroy the other simply as other. Oh. There's a maxim, says Primo Levi, deep at the heart of many and many nations. Every stranger is an enemy. Usually this maxim lies deep and doesn't produce but jerky and uncoordinated actions. But when it becomes the premise of a syllogism, at the end of that lies the death camp for somebody. It goes like this. Every stranger is an enemy, is the other. The Jew is the other. Therefore, the Jew is an enemy. Enemies are to be destroyed. The Jew is an enemy. Therefore, the enemy, the Jew, is to be destroyed. And until we work that out of us, hardwired into us, somehow in our evolutionary history, the jerk response, every stranger, an enemy. Kill first, ask questions later. If they won't become us, kill them. Until we work that out, we need desperately to guard our laws and institutions so that we don't systematically other people and set our laws against them. You follow this, you can fill in the blank. Every stranger is an enemy. The gay is a stranger, is the other. Therefore, the gay is the enemy. Enemies are to be destroyed. Gays are enemies. Therefore, gays are to be destroyed. Fill in Muslim. Fill in blacks. Fill in. Do you follow? And what we need to do in Levi's terms is to struggle to protect our laws and institutions so that this doesn't become embedded in society, so that we don't turn our society against those who are part of us. We don't other them. Is this making sense to you? It's a very profound part of Levi. And I urge your attention to that preface, which I quoted just now, and the contour of Ulysses. If you'll allow me 2 words over and further, Levi refuses to be heroized. There is no hero in his account. Or Those who are most praised are not a hero in the classical term, though he does praise a very few. Those whose example and help were so important to it. But he insists that he was broken. If the camps were an experiment, could people be broken? Levi, I was broken. And I simply want to report to you, you'll see that in the chapter on the last one. You will, I need simply for you to understand that if a Primo Levi could be broken, I have no place to hide to think that I wouldn't be too. No place at all. This is not a novel. He doesn't write it with himself as a hero. And it stops, but it has no conclusion. The war goes on in very complex ways. And then what is perhaps his loveliest poem, and with this I'll close, for I know I'm not. It's the poem Passover. I love this one. I know many who have used it as Passover saviors. And the words are taken, many of them from Passover savior. Tell me, how is this night different from all other nights? How, tell me, is this Passover different from other Passovers? Light the lamp, open the door wide so the pilgrim can come in, Gentile or Jew. Under the rags, perhaps the prophet is concealed. You're all aware of leaving the place for the prophet Elijah to come, Eliyahu Hanabi. Let him enter and sit down with us. Let him listen, drink, sing, and celebrate Passover. Let him consume the bread of affliction, the paschal lamb, sweet mortar, and bitter herbs. This is the night of differences, in which you lean your elbow on the table, since the forbidden becomes prescribed. Evil is translated into good. We will spend the night recounting far-off events full of wonder. Because of all the wine, the mountains will skip like rams. Tonight they exchange questions, the wise, the godless, the simple-minded, and the child. And time reverses its course. Today flowing back into yesterday, like a river enclosed at its mouth. Each of us has been a slave in Egypt, soaked straw and clay with sweat. That's Auschwitz too. And crossed the sea, dry-footed. You too, stranger. This year in fear and shame. Next year, and what's the traditional ending of that? Next year in virtue and in justice. But did you notice? It's not every stranger is an enemy. Every stranger may be Elijah, Gentile, or Jew. Let them celebrate at the table of the post-Auschwitz Passover. I find it one of the most moving of Primo Levi's works. And may the time come, Lord, whether it's to your generation, that we can receive the stranger with the possibility that it may be the prophet complete the table. Next year in virtue and in justice.
And how would you say that in the Italian, so we hear that?
Let me get the text. So I want to give it to you.
Yeah.
I hope it's within this poem.
Sorry.
No. I think I can give it at any rate. This year, quest'anno, ho remembered it. Quest'anno in paura e vergogna, this year in fear and shame. Il prossimo, next year. Il prossimo anniversario. in virtu e in justitia. Justice. Wow. Well, there's so much more about Primo Levi I'd love to speak with you of. He has a clarity of mind, a purity of mind, which is equal to any I've known. It's a rigorous mind. He makes moral distinctions. That story about Kuhn, you remember, put a prayer shawl around him that night after he was saved. And the young man went to death, clearly in his place. And thank God that it pleased God to spare him. And Levi at the end of the chapter, if I were God, I would expect that man's prayer out of my mouth. The idea that there would be a God who would send a young man to his death that way, that Hugh could conceive of thanking God that it pleased him to spare him, Hugh, at the expense of the younger man. If I were God, I would expect that man's prayer out of my mouth. It's that moral passion which is believed next year in peace, justice, longs. Well, listen, thanks so much for the chance to be with you I'd love to take questions, but I realize the time. You've been wonderful to be here. If there's a burning question which anyone wants to ask, I'm here. Stay out here. The rest of you.